Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire were worse than you remember. That's the video I was planning to make before going back and playing through the game again. At that point, it had been roughly 5 years since my last time seeing it through, so I thought it could have been my personal bias sitting in the way of the game's light. So I knew going into this video for a more objective approach would be fun at the very least. After all, this is a 3DS remake of a certified GBA classic. One is from an era that gets significantly more flack than the games in question deserve, with quality that often gets ignored, while of course being based on one of the two obvious generations that get the exact opposite side of that coin. More praise, games being talked about much more, but with the flaws hidden underneath for some reason. So yeah, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, a set of games with rabid optimizations, weird steps backwards, and the arguable holder of the best remake title. And today we're here to dig through the good, the bad, and the everything else to figure out why. Let's begin. Being Ruby and Sapphire again means one thing, pal. We go to Hoenn again, but this time better. This take on the most overhyped region took what worked the first time around, neglected stuff from the second iteration for some reason, and gave us not only a modernization of the region, not only one that works well, but one that's also generally fun to play through. We'll catch up on those reasons in a minute, but first, the region's makeover. Visually speaking, the transition from 2D to 3D was not a very pretty one, mostly because the overall character models look a little, not sized right. Something that in battle is never an issue because the character dimensions actually look good and not crunched for some reason, but visually speaking isn't the important focus here, because obviously the gameplay is what matters most. In the regards of play space, some areas got reworks for good and bad. Mauville becoming this super city nonsense makes it massive for the sake of being just that. A more complicated layout for sure, but ultimately has a lot of utility. And while areas like Moss Deep City, Route 114, Mount Chimney, the Evil Team hideout, which actually stays in the post-game this time around, the Seafloor Cavern, most of the gyms, Victory Road, the Cave of Origin, got less important reworks of varying scale. A few areas in the game, though, did not make it out as definitely improved. Granite Cave, due to the main part of the dungeon being locked off until after the Mach Bike, ends up blocking encounters, items, and trainers until a bit later in the game. Sky Pillar's arguably worse. Sure, Sky Pillar looks cool and all, but remember what we had before? Absolutely thrilling. Sea Mauville's just once again an oddity, regardless of the redesign. And the controversial one being Mount Pyre, which requires you to actually explore several floors in order to progress in the main story, being a healthy change to the game that some people may not like. While locations are one thing, playing through the world is quite a bit better, mainly because the game's story does a much better job at stating where to go to actually progress the story, which was a pretty annoying weakness the originals had. However, backtracking specifically is where the game gets a much more massive edge. Essentially just being filler content or a general waste of time, backtracking is never a fun task. There were always 5 big instances of that in the game. The trip to Mount Chimney after Meteor Falls, going to the Petalburg Gym after the one in Lava Ridge, the returning trip to Mauville after the Petalburg Gym, and the trips both to and from Slateport when the submarine gets jacked in the story. Here in ORAS, they actually cut down on those trips, as NPCs will actually take you close to where you need to be in order to progress the story, and with one exception, they're optional shortcuts. So, did they all get fixed? Well, all but one of them actually. Yeah, the one that stayed in the game was the most offensive backtracking trip, Mount Pyre to Slateport Harbor. It's a long trip, and with the Mount Pyre rework from earlier, it ends up being pretty punishing for those who choose not to teach a Pokemon fly. But hey, 4 for 5 on purging backtracking. Not bad. Although speaking of fly, the game's use of HMs is still negatively noteworthy. Cut and fly are of course not mandatory to beat the game again. Flash is not even an HM this time around, and the rooms that did need it are lit up poorly, but not poorly enough to even justify wasting the move slot on the Pokemon. So this got better somehow. Rock Smash, Strength, Surf, and Waterfall are just given to you when progressing the game now, making them completely impossible to miss. Fly itself actually receives a buff this time around, as it becomes able to take you to any route or dungeon when trying to fast travel, alongside the already included towns. But unluckily for Fly, it became became obsolete in this game, as a new mechanic was added to allow you to fly around in Hoenn skies, being a slower but strong alternative to fly around without using a move slot on one of your Pokemon, while having benefits of its own I'll drone on about later. And of course, before touching on the gameplay, one little thing needs to be talked about: the music. An improvement on most of the game's soundtrack that was already pretty damn solid. Although with that massive wall of positives, two tracks in particular stand out to me as ruined, and it comes down to a simple, distinct lack of clapping sounds. Yeah, irrelevant, I know. The uniqueness is gone, damn it. Let me have this personal gripe. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the big guns to come out. Time to observe this game's pretty wacky gameplay shenanigans. When it comes to the gameplay of ORAS, so much went right, and others, while not great, are at least better than before. As it's a Generation 6 game, it is forced to deal with battle mechanics that aren't as good as its contemporaries. So as a remake, it ends up getting quite a load of features, mechanical reworks, and optimizations for the 3 generations to follow the originals. So improvements like Gen 4's physical special split, Gen 5's introduction of hidden abilities and unlimited use TMs, both Gen 5's and 6's alternate battle formats, Gen 6's fairy types, all of the attack and ability reworks from the years, but standing out like a sore thumb is Mega Evolution's inclusion in the game. On average, Gen 6 as a battle formula is pretty iffy, and that is of course comparing it mechanically to the games released both before and after generationally speaking. It's a needed step forward for sure, but that's a conversation worth saving for another time. Just to know, comparatively to the originals, better on most fronts, but to pretend ORAS didn't add a few things to the battling pool would of course be turning a blind eye. Starting it off, Megas. We got loads of them now, from absolutely unimpressive to starters to holy hell why. If we have to live in a world with Megas, the selection chosen was pretty nice all things considered. Where's Mega Flygon, you ask? It's called Mega Garchomp, which already existed. But hold on, we haven't even gotten to the insane power creep of the box art legendaries. Firstly, Game Freak decided to give us their most broken crayon eating creation of all time. Sorry, second most broken glue eating second fiddle of all time. Your preparations may be superior, your play may be superior, but you will still lose. Unfortunate for sure, but that's because this mon is completely absurd. Try to explain to me for a second how a Pokemon with these stats, being able to Mega Evolve through an attack rather than an item, with an ability to override the weaker weathers, was going to be remotely balanced under any form or fashion. It's a Pokemon that is so straightforward in how broken it is, that a toddler could use it correctly. Okay, but imagine this, right? What if you were able to have 3 completely bonkers Megas on your team? Yeah, because get this. The primal forms of Kyogre and Groudon are essentially Mega Pokemon, minus the part where they are actually Megas, allowing you both primals and a Mega on the same team. God forbid we move to Usum and slap on Ultra Necrozma for a 4th. This wouldn't be such a problem if these mons were actually balanced in any form or fashion, but instead, they are completely overtuned and fantastic. Sorry, that's just me talking about Primal Kyogre. Primal Groudon, on the other hand, is an entirely different beast, being one of the most absurdly, purposely overpowered monstrosities ever created. These 3 end up being completely unbalanced for sure, but at the same time, as long as you're not on the receiving end of it, it can be quite fun. Although sitting through 3 cutscenes in the same game is definitely not fun. Speaking of foul, ORAS follows in the steps of Heart Gold Soul Silver in terms of giving you a Pikachu evolutionary line Pokemon incapable of leaving the game. Yeah, cosplay Pikachu is just that, but unlike the spiky-eared Pichu of times past, this thing actually has more going on, as it gets more than one form, each with their own exclusive attacks. Yeah, so it's just like Rotom, but in Platinum and Heart Gold Soul Silver. Hoopa actually gets a crazy new dummy form this time around that changes similarly to Shaman, but uniquely reverts back after a few days pass. And finally, rounding out the new content for the battle scene is new attacks, that of the Weather Trio and Hoopa. But the obvious answers are boring, so I ask, did you know that 1000 arrows and 1000 waves were coded into the game but unobtainable? Yeah, it's a fun fact for sure, but pretty pointless all things considered. And with the fun out of the way, it's time to overly stress out on counting loads of Pokemon for the actual playthrough, of course. Yep, it's time for all the fun playthrough related nonsense. Of course, starting with the Pokemon selection. Both iterations of Hoenn in Generation 3 had a neat count for their Pokedex for the time, which was 200 total mons to mess mess around with Emerald having extras outside of its regional Pokedex in the postgame. In Ruby and Sapphire's case, 3 of those mons in the Pokedex were postgame only, and in Emerald's 4. However, the lineup for ORAS is completely absurd, but in a more bothersome way. So before counting, I just want to note one thing. Just how well this Pokedex's presentation is. Mons being organized in the order in which they should actually be encountered in the game makes finding them easy, while the top screen itself just has everything, making searching for mons very easy beyond your imagination. Anyways, number time. So first, we gotta take the regional Pokedex, this time listed with 211, subtract 3 for both the postgame and the mythicals. Now we add 23 for the legendaries outside of the regional decks that are obtainable during the main story, even if some are completely unreasonable to obtain during that time. Add the 6 encounters from the Soaring Through the Sky feature, add 67 encounters for the basic Mirage spots, and add a small dose of 120 encounters through DexNav once the primal event in the story is done. And yes, I did avoid counting dupes here, which means if all my math is correct, that's roughly 424 Pokemon either obtainable or battleable during the main game, being more than most regional Pokedexes. But that's not all, as if we add the 30 gift encounters, if we add the 4 Battle Resort Wild encounters, and if we add the Spirit Tomb, that's roughly 462 Pokemon obtainable in the games across the board. A surprisingly strong showing overall. And it's made better as, unlike a certain remake, the game actually decided to add location-based evolutions to the game, actually making them obtainable, with the new Mauville evolutions for Probopass and Magnezone being the 2 of note here because Eevee's just really too late in the game. And of course for the main game, which we were trying to analyze first, the type diversity is just better, especially considering the water types. When we talked about Ruby and Sapphire previously, I memed on the amount of water types the game had obtainable. There were 23 fully evolved water types back then, but here, in the main game, we now have a genuinely criminal 37 fully evolved water types. And of course, this number excludes the Megas, Primal Kyogre, and the 2 water types that turn into different types upon evolving. But here's mention of them now, just in case you want to add them for yourself. Regardless, it's time to move on and observe the trainers, boss fights, and that other shenanigans. For reasons we'll touch on later with the level curve, the trainers feel right to an odd extent, with regular trainers being pretty standard and generally nice overall. Moving towards the boss trainers, we have to cry a little bit as a lot of the more positive notes from Emerald were tossed out. Looking specifically at the gym leaders, for some reason their Pokemon choices are the same as they were in Ruby and Sapphire. Well, with one exception. For comparison's sake, this only ends up really benefiting Winona's team due to her keeping the Swellow, while for the others, it's a bit of a downgrade across the board, as excluding Roxanne, their Emerald counterparts got extra Hoenn Pokemon on their team. You know, the game's main focal point, which at the time was the new stuff. Hoenn, the region we're playing in, which is a bit annoying as once again, Watson is sitting here LARPing as a Johto gym leader, as of course he only has Kanto Pokemon on his team. Although I will say, at least the teams this time around do make decent use of the changes from the past few generations, by using new attacks that can warp how battles will go, having stuff like reworked abilities, and using attacks that are actually affected by the physical special split. Looking at the Elite Four, Phoebe and Glacia using mons that didn't exist before is neat, but more thrilling than that is that Drake actually gets a team that essentially merges both that of the games prior, throwing out that useless Shelgon for that disgusting Kingdra, and revamping the Flygons to specialize in both sides of the physical special split. Honestly, it sucks this Drake fight even exists considering the care put into it versus the other boss trainers in the game. But hold up, we're not done yet, as Steven, the evil team boss, Wally, and the post-credits rival fight now have Megas on their team. Oh boy, this game was not built for Megas. Here we have the biggest issue suffocating the game and diluting its identity. While I plan on saving the Mega Evolution rant for the X and Y video, just know for now that its inclusion in any game is very fickle. It may not be able to make a game, but it sure as hell can break one. Let's Go and Sun and Moon were lucky in this regard due to how little impact they had on the main game. But here, the feature is made available as soon as Surf becomes available, so when the game already starts getting easier. To make sure the game became a complete and utter cakewalk though, you just get a free Mega Evolving Legendary as the first Mega, and your starter shortly after, with about 39 available during the main game itself. But considering how during the game's main runtime, you only ever end up battling 4 Mega Pokemon, and for those fights that you don't end up fighting those 4 Megas, it'll be so unfair within your favor, made even worse when you get the Primal later in the game. Sure, you could not use the feature, but then you could just ignore every issue affecting any game game ever. You could just ignore your incoming debts, but it's never going to remove them from existing. Yeah, the post-game having more megas does help, but on the other hand, you have a Mega Rayquaza. You win. Overall, megas in the game, it's just rough and provides more negatives to the game than positives. But hey, that's just how it is sometimes. Although somehow, we're still not even through the game yet, as we still haven't even addressed the level curve. And here, we see a surprise turn of events, as the level curve becomes noticeably better, obviously because of the Gen 6 EXP changes. The Pokemon themselves just generally end up having more EXP yields than they did in Gen 3, which helps out quite a bit, but obviously the carry here is the EXP share, being a party-wide redistribution of EXP. Essentially, killing grinding as a concept, as your whole team's going to be perfectly set up to never need to grind, and when you do, it's for less than 10 minutes, something a few optional trainers can make very easy. And while this is very freeing, the obvious downside is how simply easy it can be to overlevel and stay overleveled. Yeah, this is a certified Gen 6 moment if I have ever seen it. When looking at the level curve itself, it actually received quite a bit of work, as firstly, the game went out of its way to add a few extra forced battles to the main story, instantly putting more EXP on the table. But the simple fact that the level curve's biggest issue was struck down helps out loads. As I've ranted about it twice before, I'll keep it simple, as after Winona's Gym, the level curve kinda stagnates for some reason, despite the abundance of evil team grunts at this point, before the level spike that was Tate and Liza, which the battles that followed kept on going with. Here in ORAS though, it's almost like the level curve doesn't collapse for no reason during this long stretch, made better by the Lily Cove rival battle no longer being optional, and leading up to Tate and Liza, level-wise, it's actually pretty good now, and the late game in general feels a lot more cohesive, as that level jump to the Elite Four is significantly less jarring. Bravo game, good job! Although rounding out this section is a singular feature exclusive to this game. Horde battles, but it's a trainer battle at the same time. It's an awesome concept, but sadly it's just potential, as there's only 2 instances of it in the game, and one of those is a post-game fight, both of which of course suffer from massive level issues. In fights like these, level gaps do need to exist, but this is an extreme way to handle them, and it doesn't help that both versions of these battles go all in on the same Pokemon. Don't get me wrong, the Intimidate spam is funny, but when Surf is something that you will have, both battles just end up being a cutscene. Anyways, that's most of Hoenn's main offering this time around. Stronger, but also irritated by Gen 6 issues. Flaws, but they don't completely kill the game. So then, let's take a gander at the other bits of gameplay we've yet to glance at. Yes, brother, it's time for the endgame content and features. The endgame content was a lineup that Ruby and Sapphire struggled with quite a bit, and unlike the game's general features, it needed the most work, as it was extremely empty outside of recycled content from Crystal. So let's begin the post-game's redemption arc by starting with the Delta episode, being the game's direct post-game story. Essentially, it's a narrative involving some extra background flavor to this iteration of Hoenn and its new history. But who cares about the lore? There's actual gameplay to be had here. Obviously, that's why we're talking about it now. And gameplay-wise, it's a bit of a mess, because of how much of it is just running around and flying from place to place and doing some really boring stuff with the occasional battle. This story is roughly an hour and a half long, and with a lot of it being dialogue and running around, it's not a good look. However, when it comes time to the actual gameplay here, it's pretty nice. The battles you run into are nicely leveled to be approachable straight out of the gate, and for a lovely positive, we actually get to see a little bit of Emerald's content worked in, mainly the Steven Tag battle in the Space Center and the fight against Wallace and his champion team from that game. But that's not the important part, as the Rayquaza plotline is what matters. They made Rayquaza a required catch, while at the same time giving you the most broken Pokemon Game Freak had ever created within the context of this generation. And this is all before a fun battle, which is your only chance to catch an incredibly frail Pokemon that'll either destroy your team or collapse from a single attack. Yeah, the only time this mythical has ever been obtainable during the game without an event. Overall, the Delta episode gameplay-wise is okay at best and frustrating at worst. While it provides fun fights, a lot of it just ends up feeling like filler. Thankfully, this alone is more post-game than Ruby and Sapphire ever had, and if it stopped there, maybe that would be a small issue, but it doesn't matter as there's a lot more to be seen. Starting with the Battle Resort being a new post-game area with a bit of utility to it, as not only does it feature a second daycare, because yeah, that's still a thing, but it's also a hub for the Battle Point related move tutors, which is a very nice nice and large lineup, while also hosting free trainers that you can rematch daily, and finally, of course, the game's battle facility, the Battle Tower! Wait, that's not right. Yeah, somehow the battle, I'm not gonna try to pronounce this thing again, from X and Y, made its way into the game instead. Overall, for the one-to-one comparison with the originals, it's a better battle facility as it features the two primary battle formats alongside the funny two from Generation 5, but when looking at Emerald and all the nonsense it had, yeah, you can see why it's a bit of a bummer to not have that mass amount of content that most people would have loved to have in the game despite never playing it back in Emerald. But hey, who wouldn't want 7 whole battle facilities rather than 1? Although at the end of the day, it always could have just been a singular battle tower again. So this is a W. But keeping up on our lineup of post-game, we get the Elite Four Round 2 once more. For the 6th time in the series, we get the classic of a post-game Elite Four run with enhanced teams, this time featuring better Pokemon variety, a noticeable level jump that does not let Mega Rayquaza solo the whole thing, even though let's be real, it probably can, and each of the trainers get Mega Evolutions of their own, which is actually a nice way to include Megas in a positive manner. Once again, as always, it's a great inclusion, and probably the best iteration of it yet. But you know what else is a good inclusion? A natural evolution of the secret base feature, as it's everything it used to be and more. Basic base building straight out of using secret power in the overworld leads you to decorating your base to your heart's content and all that other nonsense. The evolution comes in as your secret base pals have more important benefits, like the ability to do things for you, like get you items and levels, as well as having their battles return once more, which is even more thrilling because of online existing, allowing for other secret bases to be much more obtainable. The only real complaint here comes to customization, mostly due to you being unable to edit your room. Completely unrelated, but yeah, you're not able to decorate your room with your dolls anymore. It's a bummer, but let's be real, 99% of players didn't even notice it was gone. They were too busy staring down the Wii U. Pokemon contests return, and I would say they're better than ever, if it were true that is. But essentially it plays out mostly the same as it did before, with far more attacks, and this time with Mega Evolutions thrown in because of course they had to. Although it is pretty hard to get one off, to the point where I couldn't do it myself. And while that's fine and dandy, it gets even better, obviously. Mostly as outside the contests themselves, through the Pokeblock specifically, as firstly, it's just given to you during the main story, so you're not gonna accidentally miss the Pokeblock case. But that's less important. As secondly, you are no longer capped on the amount of Pokeblocks you can feed a Pokemon. Finally, making it easier to cap off a single stat. God forbid all 5, making it far easier to use the same Pokemon in many scenarios, and of course making that melodic evolution not a headache. Oh yeah, and the Pokeblocks get made automatically now, so no more minigame. But let's be real, this simplification here is better, because of how much time it saves. Overall, making contests far less of a headache. Okay, so let's take a step back real quick for the next feature. Earlier I mentioned the soaring through the sky mechanic, allowing you a fly alternative as another form of fast travel. Now it's time to look at its other aspects, as the game grants you access to regular encounters, access to areas with legendaries, and to the same extent, the mirror spots, as these are areas in the game chosen at random to appear in your game that you cannot directly fly to through the fly menu. So instead of a lottery-breaking luck check, because yeah, the OG Mirage Island is gone now, the islands end up rotating daily, and more get added to it through connecting to the internet, keeping a fun spice of life that's mostly noticeable now, because yeah, the original Mirage Island was so unnoticeable that I completely forgot to even mention it in the Ruby and Sapphire video. Whoops! Moving on, we got all the wacky stuff on the bottom screen. Starting us off is the return of X and Y's bottom screen features. Super Training returns to make viewing EVs and gaining them ungodly easier. Pokemon and Me is back for all of your Pokemon interaction purposes, and the affection boosts to boot, alongside its minigames, as well as the return of the PSS and its awesome and convenient connectivity, and thrilling features, of course, like your online battling, and Gen 6 newly birthed Wonder Trades. And powers, baby, let's go! All this stuff returning is absolutely crazy, but of course there's more to be seen, as not only is the town map on the bottom screen actually tracking your movement across the routes and towns you're in, not only does the basic TV text exist on the bottom screen, not that it's very important, DexNav is also hosted here, which is a very entertaining feature that not only shows you every single encounter on the route, but allows you to force any encounter on the route to appear as a contact encounter. Granted that you've caught it before, primarily being the way you'll get the game's extra encounters that occur after the primal event during the main story, as the game spawns the regular encounters in the overworld for you to sneak into. Hey look, a new movement tech, allowing you to fight them on and battle it as you would like. All while the bottom screen itself will tell you some neat details about the encounter, like their level, potential held item, their ability with a chance of a hidden ability, ability or potential egg moves, making the game actually have higher value encounters in a more traditional sense that you do in fact have some control over, making for a very swell feature. Sadly, one feature that's pretty much copy and pasted from before is the game's trainer rematch system, as after beating a regular trainer, they'll be eligible for a rematch with time, backed by enhanced teams, but not with a phone call or anything. Thankfully, the lineup of who's available to be rebattled can be checked from the route screen on the town map, and their teams are even showcased, which is nice. Although the gym leaders are grouped in, and sadly, they're not able to be rematched at all. Looking back at some minor features most people forget about, we get to start with the Trick House. The Trick House itself saw some minor altercations, mainly as its puzzles were revamped. However, instead of 8 rooms, we now have 6 in the game. But hey, it's still a neat experience. Up next, we got 4 features, all of which are in Mauville City. First up, the Battle Institute from the Generation 5 games found itself somehow not cut. It's essentially a copy and paste with the new Gen 6 stuff. 5 battles in a row, and you get graded on your performance at the end. It's a fun inclusion that most people will never know it's in the game, but hey, it is a neat alternative to earn battle points. Another feature that's essentially a copy and paste is the Mauville Food Court, being a bit of a clone from the restaurants in X and Y, but not quite the same, as you end up choosing one of 3 meals, each of which are tied to their own respective battle formats. You'll end up battling many trainers in a row, however, now the run ends when the food is ready, rather than after you beat every trainer. Yep, that's it. Kind of lacking overall, but at least the rewards are neat. Speaking of returning X and Y content, the Inverse Battle Stop exists to get this, let you do inverse battles. For what it lacks in content, only being playable once a day, it makes up for just being a fun take on battling, with the type chart just being inverted. Say it with me, ladies and gentlemen, pure bliss. Okay, moving away from the battling related content, we have, get this again, another feature from X and Y. Pokemiles return and exist once again as a currency gained from communicating with other players, or something to that extent, to be exchanged for goodies. Yeah, there's not really much else for me to say here. Looking at our smaller features, we have fishing. The catch here is the fact there isn't a catch, as it works exactly as it would in most other games, meaning it's not terrible like it was in the original. Berry growing also returns, lacking the features improvements that generations 4 and 6 had. Seriously, why is the mulch gone? Where is it? Why do only one of the remakes even have the feature? Surfing in the game has a minor quirk with it this time around, by default functioning as it always has. But when you surf using one of 3 Pokemon, they'll have their unique model in the overworld. While Wilmer itself has no gameplay benefits, Kyogre ends up moving a bit faster, and Sharpedo of course moves much faster, adding a neat cosmetic flair to brighten up the game sometimes, and obviously being the inspiration for the ride Pokemon of Generation 7. And finally, for positives, by talking to a few specific NPCs in the overworld, you will gain the ability to grab both of the game's bikes at the same time, completely throwing out the need to switch them every single time you want to use the other. And earning the ability to do so is surprisingly easy, although a bummer due to having to wait till the post-game. Sadly, we do have a few issues here, if you can even call them that. First up, trainer customization does not even make it into the game under any form or fashion, keeping the trainer way too samey every single time you play the game. The game corner is completely axed this time around. No, there's not even a substitute here this time around. It's just gone, meaning one less way to earn rewards of some kind. And finally, we get to the Safari Zone. While it's still in the game, it's been neutered beyond belief, as instead of having step counters and a set amount of balls, or anything genuinely unique to it, it's essentially been degraded to a regular area within the game with standard encounters. While it's nice that you may not skip grabbing your key to the entry anymore, by the Pokeblock case of course being given to you during the main story, having encounters that can't run away and free entry are some very nice benefits. It does hurt quite a bit that it's only a Safari Zone in name now rather than an actual feature. In terms of the content, the game is surprisingly robust for sure. While it may have a few downsides, that laundry list of positives is completely bonkers, and it actually gives you reasons to keep playing the game outside of just throwing one reason at a wall constantly. However, ORAS has one last aspect of the game to observe. Yeah, it's time for the story. Ugh. The story, as you'd expect, is very much the same as it was before, for better or for worse. And the bad part? Me having to summarize this mess for a 3rd time. Your trainer moves in, makes friends with characters that receive more story relevance this time around, before getting dragged into a war with extreme environmentalists, based on the game being played, with their goal of reviving the super ancient Pokemon, bringing forth an apocalypse further put on steroids due to that Pokemon's access to primal reversion this time around. around, meaning instead of agony, we get agony 2. For the most part, excluding some background details and obvious character redesigns, the story ends up being mostly the same, with better writing this time around to make everything fit better. The main conflict ends up being a little bit stronger during the story. Now, the side characters, being your rivals, they actually get better as well. During the main story, there's pretty much one extra moment in the story for Wally, and one strong improvement. The new scene is more of a character development moment for your character's father, let's be real, while being an excuse to kill a backtracking trip. His improved scene, on the other hand, is of course his fight at Victory Road, which the presentation of the scene is just much better. Him having an actual battle theme this time around helps, although it's really just the characterization. Just from one extra scene helps him not go completely forgotten. And a sight of him being at Victory Road later in the game at least foreshadows the fight that you'll see against him, which unlike the original games where he only appeared 3 times total, and with that final encounter being a surprise rather than it being earned. Now, your main rival on the other hand got a pretty big leg up. A character that exclusively existed for battles, previously having only 3 forced battles with a sheer lack of any character. In ORAS, they get quite a bit more screen time, in areas that feel both unnecessary and very positive additions for the actual gameplay, where they at least try to help fight against the evil team instead of hardly even knowing they exist. But character-wise, they're still pretty barren. Their attempted friendship here feels a little bit more natural, especially with that final battle straight after the credits, but the credits rolling means one thing: post-game narrative. While the gameplay section of the Delta episode is a bit of a mess, the story side of it is a little bit more cohesive, beginning with the impending doom on Hoenn, with an inbound meteor on a collision course to wipe out as much as possible. Something happens, you get dragged into it later for annoying fetch quests. But hey, I'm getting ahead of myself, as of course not everything can be so straightforward, as this pain in the rear here is going around and snatching keystones from the game's important characters for her own goals. We'll get back to this. But as you're running around, you come across an upset evil team admin at the same time causing trouble of their own. The plot for this section ends up being a little irrelevant, as afterwards you just end up running around fetching a rock and then another rock, before learning that Maxie and Archie's plan to bring back the Primal Legendary was all planned by this girl here, completely undermining the evil teams as a whole. But speaking of that evil team, it turns out that rogue admin from earlier snagged the thing humanity needs to not disappear off the face of the map. So you follow in pursuit to learn that they want to detonate the rocket at the Space Center as revenge for foiling their leader's plans, doing at least a nice job at repurposing Emerald Space Center stuff, just to a lesser extent. And while you do end up stopping them, Zinnia decides to show up and ruins your plan anyway, and then goes on some psycho rant about how if the plan went through, simply moving the meteor could cause some kind of catastrophe for a parallel universe that doesn't have the power to rid itself of that meteor. Basically, this just confirms that multiverses exist, although let's be real, we kind of know this already, as we've had versions of Kanto that have had plenty of Sandshrew and no Sandshrew, versions of Johto that have Voltorb Flip and don't have Voltorb Flip, and then of course those alternate realities where the evil team leaders actually succeeded. But cool, whatever. A man gets robbed, you go on a detour before getting dragged into a very fan-servicey battle, and finally begin the Delta episode's climax. Extensive dialogue before being forced to catch Rayquaza. Yes, you are required to catch it. Battling this hooligan, and of course riding Game Freak's most broken abomination straight through a damn meteor. Saving the day, of course, after accidentally killing the Deoxys. And then you live happily ever after. The end. Overall, for a remake, they do a nice job at making the finer details more stand out, further improving characters with better character moments and whatnot, making a pretty mediocre story less of that. So we're at the end of this tragic tale. Tragic for me, of course, as you've seen how this video has gone. I gotta give it praise, even though I really don't want to. I don't want to say this lightly, but guys, get this. Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are currently the best Pokemon remakes. No band-aid solutions, no keeping the main game too samey because it's the remake of the first game, and no whatever BDSP is supposed to be, because it's a remake that actively tried to get the game's main experience done right, across many aspects of the game, and even ignoring the remake status, the game is still pretty solid on its own merits, with the only real issues coming down to the art style style, and how the game ends up being too easy due to stuff like Megas and the Gen 6 EXP system. But if too easy actually mattered, it doesn't, then it could be a different story entirely, which is a discussion I'm saving in regards to Pokemon X and Y. Here, the positives manage to far outweigh the negatives. Grinding essentially doesn't exist, cutting out on filler. Most modernizations end up being a massive improvement, and not to mention the addition of actual post-game content. It makes for a significantly better and more complete experience. Yeah, there is missed potential, but if that actually mattered, we'd still be hearing about it today. And let's be real, every single game has missed potential. So, should you play Pokemon Mega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire? Yes, sir! Much like Emerald itself, the game is just Ruby and Sapphire, but better. And due to being a newer game, you will waste significantly less time playing the game overall. 4 stars, by the way. Before going in, I thought it would be a 3. But hey, at least I was able to set aside my personal gripes and see it through the way it was meant to go down. And for those who want to know my personal thoughts on the game and why I dislike it so much, that's just the simple fact that I would have much preferred for a remake of what technically was my first game to be a little more faithful. And by that, I mean not having Mega Evolution shoehorned into the game and making a mess of its identity. That's it, that's the only reason. So with ORAS taken out back, ladies and gentlemen, only 2 more mainline games remain. So hopefully you will join me next time as we take a trip down through Kalos and attempt to discover the validity of the criticisms people have for those games. So as always, thank you for watching, and until next time, could you stop putting me through these Mega Evolution cutscenes?